The rain lashed against the windows of the Blackwood estate like 1,000 frantic fingers trying to get inside. But the real storm was happening indoors, in the suffocating silence of the nursery. 10-year-old Leo sat huddled in the corner, his small frame trembling as his stepmother, Evelyn, towered over him. Her voice wasn't a scream. It was a cold, sharp blade. "You think your father loves you?" she whispered, leaning so close he could smell her expensive, cloying perfume. "He sees a burden. He sees the reason your mother is dead. Every time he looks at you, he's reminded of his greatest mistake. And soon, Leo, I'm going to make sure he never has to look at you again." She didn't hear the floorboard creak in the hallway. She didn't see the shadow stretching across the threshold of the cracked door. Thomas, a man who had spent years buried in grief and work, stood frozen in the dark. His hand gripped the brass handle so hard his knuckles turned white. For months, he had been told Leo was difficult and rebellious. He had almost believed it. But as the woman he married revealed the venom behind her polished mask, the world Thomas thought he knew shattered. He didn't just open the door. He destroyed the lie. The Blackwood mansion was a masterpiece of glass and steel, perched on a cliffside overlooking the churning gray Atlantic. To the outside world, it was a symbol of success. To young Leo, it was a labyrinth of ghosts. It had been 3 years since the accident that took his mother, Sarah. 3 years since the laughter had died in the hallways, replaced by the rhythmic ticking of grandfather clocks and the soft, clinical footsteps of housekeepers. Thomas, Leo's father, had retreated into his architecture firm, building skyscrapers to avoid the crumbling ruins of his own heart. When Evelyn arrived a year ago, she brought color back into the house, or so it seemed. She was a high-end interior designer, elegant and poised, with a smile that never quite reached her eyes. Thomas saw her as a lifeline, a way to provide Leo with the maternal presence he was missing. "He needs a woman's touch, Thomas," Evelyn had said during their first dinner. "The boy is drowning in this gloom." Leo remembered that dinner vividly. He had reached for a piece of bread, and Evelyn's eyes had flickered toward his hand, not with warmth, but with a cold, analytical judgment. Now, Leo sat in his bedroom, staring at a framed photo of his mother. She was laughing, her hair windblown on a beach. He missed the way she smelled like vanilla and sea salt. "Leo, are you staring at that again?" Evelyn stood in the doorway. She was dressed in a silk robe, her hair perfectly coiffed, even at 9 p.m. "I was just looking at her," Leo said quietly, his voice small. "It's been 3 years. Dwelling on the dead won't bring them back. It only makes you weak," she said, walking into the room. She picked up the photo, her fingers trailing over the glass. "Your father is downstairs trying to finish a multi-million-dollar proposal. Do you think he wants to see you moping? It stresses him out. And when he's stressed, he makes mistakes." "I'm not moping," Leo protested, a spark of defiance in his chest. "I just miss her." Evelyn set the photo down, face down on the nightstand. "Go to sleep, and don't let me catch you crying. It's pathetic." As she turned to leave, she paused at the light switch. "Oh, and Leo, don't bother coming down for breakfast tomorrow. We have guests, and I won't have you embarrassing us with your moods." The click of the light switch felt like a gunshot. Leo lay in the dark, the silence of the house pressing down on him. He could hear the faint murmur of his father's voice from the study below, a deep, comforting rumble that felt 1,000,000 miles away. He wanted to run down there, to jump into his father's lap and tell him how lonely he was. But he remembered Evelyn's words. He sees a burden. In the study, Thomas rubbed his eyes, staring at the blueprints on his desk. He felt a presence in the doorway and looked up to see Evelyn standing there, a warm smile on her face, and 2 mugs of tea in her hands. "How is he?" Thomas asked, his voice weary. "Tough night," Evelyn sighed, setting the tea down. "He threw a bit of a tantrum about his mother again. I tried to comfort him, but he's so resistant. He told me he wished I'd never come here." Thomas winced. "He said that? He's usually so polite." "Grief does strange things to a child, darling," Evelyn said, rubbing his shoulders. "But don't worry, I'm handling it. You focus on the project. We need this win for the family." Thomas sighed, leaning back into her touch. He felt a pang of guilt. He wasn't there enough for his son, but at least he had Evelyn. She was the glue holding them together, or so he believed. Underneath the table, Evelyn's phone buzzed. She glanced at it, a message from an unsaved number. "The accounts are ready. Just give the word." She deleted it instantly, her smile never wavering. The morning sun hit the cliffs of the Blackwood estate with a blinding glare. But inside the dining room, the atmosphere was as cold as a morgue. Evelyn sat at the head of the mahogany table, her silver spoon clinking rhythmically against a porcelain bowl of grapefruit. She was the picture of grace, a stark contrast to Thomas, who sat opposite her, nursing a black coffee with dark circles under his eyes. "He's still asleep?" Thomas asked, glancing toward the grand staircase. "I told him to stay in his room, Thomas," Evelyn said, her voice smooth as silk. "He had a night terror, quite a violent one. I thought it best he rest while the caterers are here for the luncheon. You know how sensitive he gets around crowds." Thomas frowned, his heart heavy. "Another one?" "He hasn't had night terrors since the first year after the funeral. Maybe I should take him to see Dr. Arris again." Evelyn's grip on her spoon tightened for a fraction of a second. "And drag up all that trauma?" "No, darling. He just needs stability. He needs discipline. He's been acting out because he thinks he can manipulate your guilt. If you coddle him now, he'll never grow up." Thomas sighed, looking out at the gray Atlantic. He felt like he was failing a test he didn't know the rules to. "I just want him to be happy, Ev. He's all I have left of Sarah." Evelyn's expression didn't change, but her eyes darkened. She hated that name. Sarah. The woman whose ghost still haunted every corridor, whose portrait, though moved to the attic, still seemed to watch her from the shadows. "You have us now!" Evelyn corrected him gently, reaching across the table to squeeze his hand. "And I am doing everything in my power to make this a real home. Now go! You have the board meeting. Leave Leo to me. We'll have a quiet day together." As soon as the sound of Thomas's SUV faded down the long, gravel driveway, the mask dropped. Evelyn stood up, her movements sharp and predatory. She walked to the intercom on the wall and pressed the button for Leo's room. "Leo kitchen, now." 5 minutes later, the young boy appeared. He was wearing an oversized hoodie, his eyes red-rimmed. He looked like a small animal expecting a blow. "I told you not to come down for breakfast," she said, not looking at him as she poured a glass of green juice. "I was hungry," Leo whispered. "Hunger is a sign of a lack of self-control," Evelyn snapped. She pointed to a pile of heavy, silver-plated platters sitting on the counter. "The caterers will be here in an hour. These need to be polished. Every single one. If I see a smudge, you don't eat lunch either." "But the housekeeper usually does that," Leo stammered. "Mrs. Higgins is on leave for a week. I sent her home," Evelyn said with a chilling smile. "I told your father she needed a vacation. In reality, I think we both know she was too soft on you. Now get to work, and if you speak a word of this to your father, I'll tell him you broke the Ming vase in the hallway. Do you know what he'll do then? He'll send you to that boarding school in Switzerland he's been talking about. The one for troubled boys." Leo's heart hammered against his ribs. Boarding school. The threat hung over him like a guillotine. He knew his father was stressed. He knew his father was struggling. He didn't want to be the reason his father broke. He picked up a rag and a tin of polish. His small hands began to scrub. Upstairs, in the privacy of her dressing room, Evelyn pulled out a second phone, a burner she kept hidden in a hollowed-out book. She dialed a number. "Is the transfer ready?" she asked, her voice hushed. "Almost," a gravelly voice replied. "But the firm's auditors are flagging the renovation expenses for the estate. You've funneled nearly $200,000 into that shell company this month alone. Thomas is going to notice. Thomas notices nothing but his blueprints and his grief." Evelyn hissed. "By the time he wakes up, the accounts will be drained, and I'll be halfway to the Caymans with the boys' trust fund. Just keep the paper trail messy for another 2 weeks." She hung up, catching her reflection in the mirror. She looked beautiful. She looked innocent. She looked like the savior of a broken family. She heard a soft clink from downstairs, Leo dropping a platter, her face contorted into a mask of pure malice. "Useless brat," she muttered, heading for the stairs. She didn't know that Leo wasn't just polishing. He was listening. He had moved the rag near the vent that connected to the dressing room. He hadn't understood everything. Shell companies and trust funds were foreign words. But he understood one thing clearly. Evelyn was planning to leave. And she was planning to take everything his mother had left for him. The weight of the silver platter felt like a mountain in Leo's small hands. His arms ached, but the fear in his chest was heavier. He had heard her voice through the vent, sharp, cold, and calculating. She wasn't the woman his father kissed goodbye every morning. She was a stranger wearing his stepmother's skin. "Why are you stopping?" Evelyn's voice drifted down from the staircase, clicking like a metronome as her heels hit the marble. Leo quickly looked down, scrubbing a spot that wasn't there. "I'm almost done," Leo whispered, his heart hammering against his ribs. Evelyn walked into the kitchen, her eyes scanning the counter with the precision of a hawk. She picked up a polished tray, tilting it toward the light. "There's a smudge, Leo, right there. My guests are coming in 2 hours. Do you want your father to think you're lazy? Or worse, spiteful?" Leo shook his head, keeping his eyes on the silver. "No, ma'am. Good. When you're finished, take these boxes up to the attic. They're old files of your mother's. I'm clearing out the library to make room for my new office." Leo's head snapped up. "My mom's files? But Dad said those stay in the library? He said they were her legacy." Evelyn stepped closer, her shadow engulfing him. "Your father is too sentimental for his own good. It's holding him back. I'm the one looking toward the future. Now move, before I decide you don't need dinner tonight." Leo lugged the heavy cardboard boxes up 3 flights of stairs to the very top of the house. The attic was a dusty, forgotten realm, filled with draped furniture that looked like white ghosts in the dim light. It smelled of cedar and old paper. He set the boxes down near a small, circular window. As he did, a folder slipped out of one of the overstuffed cartons. It wasn't a business file. It was a leather-bound journal. His mother's diary. His breath hitched. He sat on the floor, the dust swirling around him in the afternoon light, and opened the first page. "Property of Sarah Blackwood. To my dearest Leo, for when you are old enough to understand." He flipped through pages of recipes, sketches of the ocean, and notes about his childhood. But toward the end, the handwriting changed. It became shaky, rushed. August 14th. Thomas brought home a new associate today. Evelyn. She's brilliant, but there's something in her eyes. She looks at our life like she's appraising jewelry. Thomas sees a partner. I see a predator. Leo's blood ran cold. This was from 4 years ago, before the accident. September 2nd. The brakes felt soft today. Thomas said it's just the salt air corroding the lines, but I saw Evelyn in the garage last night. She said she was looking for a screwdriver. Why was she near my car? I'm scared, Leo. If anything happens to me, look in the lining of the blue trunk. A floorboard creaked behind him. Leo slammed the journal shut and shoved it under his hoodie just as the attic door groaned open. What's taking so long? Evelyn stood in the doorway, her silhouette sharp against the hallway light. Just finding a spot for them, Leo said, his voice trembling. Evelyn walked into the room, her eyes narrowing as she looked at the boxes. She walked toward the blue trunk in the corner, the very one his mother had mentioned. Leo held his breath, certain she could hear his heart thumping. She rested a hand on the trunk's lid. This junk is next. Next week the junk haulers are coming to clear this all out. A fresh start, Leo. No more ghosts. She turned to him, her smile thin and cruel. Go wash your face. You look like a chimney sweep. And remember, not a word to Thomas about the library. We want him to have a nice surprise when he sees his new organized workspace, don't we? Leo nodded, backing away slowly. As he hurried down the stairs, he felt the hard edges of the journal against his stomach. His mother hadn't died in a simple accident. She had been hunted, and now the predator was turning her sights on him. The luncheon was a blur of forced smiles and clinking crystal. From the top of the stairs, hidden behind the thick oak banister, Leo watched his father. Thomas looked smaller than he used to. His shoulders slumped as he stood beside Evelyn. She looked radiant in a cream-colored dress, her hand resting possessively on Thomas's arm as she charmed the board members of his firm. To a new era for Blackwood architecture, one of the men toasted, raising a glass of champagne. And to the woman who keeps the gears turning while Thomas builds the sky. Evelyn's laugh was melodic, a sound that would have been beautiful if Leo hadn't known the venom it hid. I just do what any devoted wife would do, she said, her eyes flickering toward the staircase for a split second. Leo pulled back into the shadows. He retreated to his room, locking the door and pulling his mother's journal from under his mattress. His fingers trembled as he turned the pages, searching for the date of the accident. October 12th. I caught her today. She was in Thomas's office, looking through the trust fund documents for Leo. When I confronted her, she didn't even flinch. She just smiled and said, "Life is for the living, Sarah. You're just a relic." I told Thomas, but he thinks I'm being paranoid. He thinks she's just ambitious. I have to get the evidence. I've hidden the mechanic's report in the lining of the blue trunk. If I don't make it to the police tomorrow, the entry ended there. The next day, his mother had driven over the cliff. Leo's heart felt like it was being squeezed by a cold hand. He had to get to that blue trunk. But the attic was directly above Evelyn's bedroom, and the stairs creaked like a warning bell. He waited. The guests left. The house grew quiet as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in bruises of purple and orange. He heard his father's heavy footsteps go to the study, the sound of a man trying to work away his grief. Then he heard Evelyn's lighter, sharper footsteps head to the master suite. He waited until midnight. Slipping out of bed, Leo crept into the hallway. Every pop of the house settling sounded like a scream. He reached the attic door and pushed it open inch by inch. The blue trunk sat in the moonlight, looking like a tombstone. He knelt beside it, his fingers searching the heavy velvet lining. Nothing. He pushed harder, his nails catching on a loose thread. There, a hidden slit in the fabric. He reached in and pulled out a folded piece of yellowed paper. It was a receipt from a local mechanic, dated 2 days before the crash. Scrawled at the bottom in red ink were the words, Brake lines show signs of manual tampering. Corrosive agent applied to the seals. Advise immediate police report. Find what you were looking for? The voice came from the doorway. Leo froze, the paper crinkling in his hand. Evelyn stood there, silhouetted by the hallway light. She wasn't wearing her silk robe or her designer dresses. She was wearing black, her face a mask of cold fury. "I thought I told you," she said, stepping into the room, "that we were clearing out the ghosts. You killed her," Leo whispered, his voice cracking. "You broke the car." Evelyn laughed, a dry, rattling sound. "A tragic accident, Leo. That's what the police said. That's what your father believes. And who are they going to listen to? A grieving, successful woman? Or a lonely, disturbed little boy who spends his nights talking to his dead mother?" She walked toward him, her footsteps slow and deliberate. "Give me the paper, Leo." "No!" Leo backed away, the paper clutched to his chest. "You think you're smart?" Evelyn sneered. "I've spent a year making sure your father thinks you're losing your mind. The tantrums, the nightmares I tell him about. It's all been for this moment. If you show him that paper, I'll tell him you faked it. I'll tell him you're trying to destroy his happiness because you're jealous." She lunged for him, her fingers clawing at the air. Leo ducked under a draped armchair and bolted for the door. He didn't look back as he sprinted down the stairs, his lungs burning. He reached his father's study and slammed his fists against the wood. "Dad! Dad, help!" The door opened. Thomas stood there, looking exhausted and confused. "Leo, what's going on? Why are you screaming at this hour?" "She did it, Dad! She hurt Mom!" Leo cried, thrusting the yellow paper toward him. "Look! The mechanic said the brakes were tampered with." Thomas took the paper, his brow furrowing as he tried to read it in the dim light. "Thomas? Thank God you're awake." Evelyn appeared at the end of the hallway, her face twisted into an expression of perfect, heartbreaking concern. Tears were already welling in her eyes. "He's had another episode, Thomas," she sobbed, covering her mouth with her hand. "He broke into my room and stole that. It's a prop from an old theater project I worked on. He's been obsessed with it all week, mumbling about his mother. I was so scared he'd hurt himself." Thomas looked at the paper, then at the weeping woman, and finally at his trembling son. "Leo," Thomas said, his voice heavy with a terrifying kind of pity. "Why would you do this?" The trap had snapped shut. The look in his father's eyes was worse than any scream. It wasn't anger. It was the hollow, exhausted stare of a man who had finally given up. Thomas held the yellowed paper between two fingers as if it were a piece of trash. "A prop, Leo." Thomas's voice was a ghost of itself. "You went into Evelyn's private things to find a way to hurt her? To hurt us?" "It's not a prop, Dad! Look at the date! Look at the name of the garage!" Leo's voice cracked, his small chest heaving. "She's lying! She's been lying about everything!" Evelyn stepped forward, her hand resting delicately on Thomas's shoulder. She looked like a mourning angel, her eyes brimming with artificial salt water. "It's my fault, Thomas. I should have been firmer with his therapist. He's conflating his grief with these fantasies. He wants to cast me as the villain because he can't accept that Sarah is gone." "I saw the mechanic's report in the trunk!" Leo shouted, pointing toward the attic. "Mom hid it there! She knew!" Thomas looked up at the ceiling, then back at his son. "Leo, that trunk has been locked since the funeral. I have the only key in my desk. How could you have possibly—" "I found a way. Enough!" Thomas's voice boomed, echoing off the cold marble walls. The sudden violence of the sound made Leo flinch. "I can't do this anymore. I am trying to build a life here. I am trying to keep this family from drowning, and every day you pull us deeper into the dark. Thomas handed the paper back to Evelyn without looking at it again. Go to your room, Leo. Don't come out until tomorrow. We're calling Dr. Eris in the morning. Maybe it's time we look into that residential program Evelyn mentioned. For your own safety. Leo felt the floor drop away. Residential program. It was a polite word for a cage. As Leo turned to head up the stairs, his legs feeling like lead, he caught Evelyn's gaze over his father's shoulder. The tears were gone. Her face was a mask of cold, triumphant stone. She mouthed 3 words, silent and sharp. You lost, Leo. Leo spent the night huddled in his closet, the only place in the vast house that felt small enough to keep him safe. He clutched his mother's journal to his chest. He realized now that the mechanic's report wasn't enough. Evelyn was a master of architecture, too. She hadn't just designed rooms. She had designed a reality where Leo was broken, and she was the savior. He needed more than a piece of paper. He needed her to confess. He needed his father to hear the truth when the mask was off. Downstairs, the house was silent, but the air felt charged with electricity. In the master suite, Evelyn sat at her vanity, removing her diamond earrings. She watched Thomas in the reflection of the mirror. He was sitting on the edge of the bed, his head in his hands. You did the right thing, Thomas, she said softly. It's hard, being a parent. Sometimes love means making the difficult choices. He needs professional help that we just can't provide here. I feel like I'm betraying Sarah, Thomas whispered. Evelyn walked over and began to rub his neck, her fingers pressing into the tension of his muscles. Sarah would want him to be healthy. She wouldn't want him living in a world of delusions and hate. Once he's in the program, he'll get the care he needs, and we can finally have some peace. She kissed the top of his head, her eyes fixed on the safe in the corner of the room. Inside that safe were the documents that would finalize the transfer of the Blackwood estate's liquid assets into her private offshore account. Just 3 more days. Then the boy would be gone. The money would be hers. And Thomas Blackwood would be left with nothing but the echoes of a house that was never truly a home. But as she smiled at her reflection, she didn't notice the small, circular vent near the floorboards. And she didn't see the tiny, handheld recorder Leo had salvaged from his mother's old office supplies, tucked just inside the grating. The war had only just begun. The next 3 days passed in a suffocating haze. The house felt like a pressure cooker, the air thick with unspoken threats. Thomas barely looked at Leo during their silent meals, his eyes red-rimmed from lack of sleep and the weight of a decision he didn't want to make. Evelyn, meanwhile, was a whirlwind of helpful activity, packing Leo's bags with a practiced, somber efficiency. It's for the best, sweetheart, she whispered to Leo when Thomas stepped out to take a work call. She was folding his favorite blue sweater, the one his mother had knitted. Think of it as a long summer camp, one where they'll teach you how to be a normal boy again, or at least how to stop being such a nuisance. Leo didn't respond. He sat on the edge of his bed, his hands tucked into his pockets, clutching the small, silver digital recorder he'd hidden there. He had retrieved it from the vent that morning. He hadn't listened to it yet. He was too afraid of what he might hear, or worse, that he had captured nothing but static. The car will be here at 8 a.m. tomorrow, Evelyn continued, her voice regaining its melodic public tone as Thomas walked back into the room. The facility in the valley is world-class, Thomas. They specialize in reparenting children with traumatic attachment issues. Thomas nodded slowly, his face a mask of defeat. I'll take him myself. Actually, darling, Evelyn said, placing a hand on his chest. The director suggested it's better if the parents don't do the drop-off. It triggers the abandonment response. They have a specialized transport team. It's much more professional. Leo saw the flicker of doubt in his father's eyes. Thomas opened his mouth to protest, but Evelyn's grip tightened slightly, her smile firm. "You have the final board presentation tomorrow, remember? The one that decides the firm's future. You can't miss it. I'll handle the transport. I'll be there for him." Thomas slumped. "Right, the presentation. Okay, I'll say my goodbyes tonight." That night, the house was a tomb. Leo waited until he heard the heavy click of his father's bedroom door closing. Then, he crawled under his covers and put on a pair of old headphones, plugging them into the recorder. His heart hammered. Click, static. Then the muffled sound of a drawer opening. Check the levels. The trust fund matures on his 11th birthday, which is only 6 months away. Evelyn's voice came through, crystal clear despite the distance. "If he's in the facility by then, I can sign as his legal guardian." Thomas is too far gone to notice the fine print. Then, a man's voice, the same gravelly one from the phone call. "And the house? The renovations are already over-budgeted on paper." Evelyn laughed. "I've funneled enough into the shell company to buy 3 houses in the Caymans. Thomas thinks he's building a legacy. He's actually building my retirement." Leo's breath hitched. He waited for more, but the recording cut into the sound of a television. He had it. He had the proof. But as he looked at the door, he realized he had a problem. If he showed this to his father now, Evelyn would find a way to spin it. She'd say he faked the voices with AI, or that it was part of a game he was playing. He needed her to say it to him. He needed his father to hear it live. Leo crept out of bed and moved toward his father's study. He knew Thomas spent his nights there lately, staring at the blueprints of the house, trying to find where the foundation had cracked. But as he reached the landing, he saw a light on in the kitchen. Evelyn was standing by the counter, a glass of wine in one hand and a small white pill in the other. She was crushing the pill into a fine powder with the back of a spoon, then stirring it into a mug of herbal tea, the tea she took to Thomas every night before bed. "Sleep tight, Thomas," she whispered to the empty room, a look of pure, chilling boredom on her face. "Just one more day of playing the grieving husband, and then you can sleep forever for all I care." Leo retreated into the shadows, his blood turning to ice. She wasn't just stealing the money. She was slowly poisoning his father. He didn't have until tomorrow. He had to act tonight. But how do you stop a monster when everyone thinks you're the one who's broken? Leo looked at the grandfather clock in the hall. 11:45 p.m. He had 8 hours until the transport arrived. 8 hours to save his father and himself. He slipped back into his room and grabbed his mother's journal. He turned to the very last page, past the entries he had already read. There, scrawled in a frantic hand, was a phone number and a name. Detective Marcus Vance. "He knows. If I don't call, you must." Leo grabbed his father's old cell phone, the one Thomas kept in the hallway charging station for emergencies. With shaking fingers, he dialed the number. "Vance?" A tired voice answered on the third ring. "My name is Leo Blackwood," the boy whispered into the receiver. "You knew my mother, Sarah. I think the person who killed her is about to kill my dad." The silence on the other end of the line felt like an eternity. Leo held his breath. The cold plastic of the phone pressed hard against his ear. Finally, the voice came back, sharper now, the sleepiness replaced by a low, gravelly intensity. "Leo? Sarah's son?" Detective Vance's voice dropped an octave. "Kid, I've been waiting for a call regarding that house for 3 years. The file on your mother's accident. It never sat right with me, but the department closed it. High profile, no hard evidence, and your father's grief was so public they didn't want to harass him. She's poisoning him, Leo whispered, his eyes darting to the door. I saw her, a white pill, every night in his tea, and she's taking me away tomorrow, to a facility. But I heard her on my recorder. She's stealing the money, all of it. Listen to me very carefully, Vance said, and Leo could hear the sound of a car engine turning over in the background. Do not confront her. Do not let her know you called me. Where is the tea now? She's taking it to his study. He's been sleeping there lately. Get that mug, Leo. If he hasn't drunk it, stop him. If he has, we need the dregs. I'm 40 minutes out. Can you stay hidden until then? I'll try. Leo hung up, his hands shaking so violently he nearly dropped the phone. He crept to the door and cracked it open. The hallway was a tunnel of velvet shadows. He saw the flicker of candlelight from the study at the far end of the wing. He moved like a ghost, his bare feet silent on the cold marble. As he reached the study door, he heard Evelyn's voice, cooing, soft, the perfect imitation of a worried wife. Drink it while it's hot, Thomas. You've been working so hard on the presentation. You need the rest. Tomorrow is a big day for all of us. Thanks, Ev. Thomas's voice was thick, slurred. I feel so tired. My head feels like it's full of fog. It's just the stress, darling. Drink up. Leo peered through the keyhole. Thomas was sitting at his desk, the porcelain mug halfway to his lips. Evelyn stood behind him, her hands resting on his shoulders, her eyes fixed on the liquid with a terrifying, hungry intensity. Leo knew he couldn't just walk in. Thomas wouldn't believe him, and Evelyn would overwhelm him. He needed a distraction. He remembered the old fire alarm system in the hallway, the one his mother had insisted on installing. It was loud enough to wake the dead. He backed away from the door, reached for the red lever near the linen closet, and pulled. The house exploded into sound. A high-pitched, rhythmic screeching tore through the silence. Inside the study, Thomas jumped, spilling half the tea across his blueprints. Evelyn let out a sharp cry of frustration. "What is that?" she shrieked. "The alarm." Thomas stood up, swaying unsteadily. "The kitchen? The basement? Stay here! I'll check it!" Evelyn snapped, her composure momentarily shattered. She bolted out of the room, nearly colliding with Leo as he dove into the shadows of a large, decorative vase. As soon as she disappeared down the stairs toward the kitchen, Leo dashed into the study. "Dad, don't drink it." Leo grabbed the mug from the desk. "Leo, what are you doing? The alarm—" Thomas reached for the boy, but his legs gave way, and he slumped back into the leather chair. "She's hurting you, Dad! Look at the tea!" Leo pointed to the bottom of the cup, where a faint, milky residue had settled in the corners. It's just tea, Leo. You're having a breakdown. The alarm... Did you pull it?" Thomas's eyes were unfocused, his pupils dilated. "I had to! Detective Vance is coming! He's the one Mom told me to call!" Suddenly, the screeching of the alarm stopped. The silence that followed was even more terrifying. "Leo!" Evelyn's voice drifted up from the hallway. It wasn't worried anymore. It was flat, cold. The voice of the predator who had finally grown tired of the game. "I know you're in there, and I know you pulled that alarm." She appeared in the doorway, her silhouette framed by the dim hall light. In her hand, she wasn't holding a tea tray anymore. She was holding a heavy brass letter opener she'd snatched from the hallway table. "You really are your mother's son," she said, stepping into the room. "She didn't know when to stop digging either." Thomas looked up, his brain struggling to process the sight of his wife holding a weapon. "Evelyn, what are you saying?" "Oh, shut up, Thomas!" she spat, not taking her eyes off Leo. "You've been a walking corpse for months. I was going to let you fade away peacefully, but this brat, he just couldn't let it go. She lunged toward Leo, the brass blade glinting in the lamplight. The brass blade sliced through the air, missing Leo's shoulder by a fraction of an inch as he dove behind his father's heavy oak desk. Thomas let out a choked sound, a mix of a gasp and a cough, as he tried to stand, but the sedatives in the tea had turned his muscles to water. He slumped back, his head lolling against the leather headrest. "Evelyn, stop!" Thomas managed to wheeze, his hand feebly reaching out. "Stop?" Evelyn laughed, a jagged, hysterical sound that echoed off the high ceilings. She kicked a chair out of her way, stalking Leo like a wolf cornering a pup. "I've spent 3 years playing the grieving stepmother. 3 years of listening to your pathetic stories about Sarah. Do you know how boring you are, Thomas? How utterly small?" Leo scrambled backward, his heart hammering against his ribs so hard it felt like it would burst. He grabbed the heavy glass paperweight from the desk, a miniature of the skyscraper Thomas had designed, and held it out with trembling hands. "Stay away from him!" Leo shouted, his voice cracking but firm. "Or what, Leo? You'll throw a toy at me?" Evelyn stepped around the corner of the desk, her eyes narrowed and dark. "You're 10 years old. You're a disturbed child with a history of hallucinations. Even if you survive tonight, who do you think they'll believe? I'll tell them you had a psychotic break. I'll tell them you attacked your father, and I had to defend us." She lunged again, her movements sharp and practiced. Leo threw the paperweight. It clipped her shoulder, making her stumble, but it wasn't enough to stop her. She snarled, the polished mask of the socialite completely gone, replaced by a raw, murderous desperation. "You ruined everything!" she shrieked. "The accounts were almost clear. I was days away." Outside, through the lashing rain, a pair of headlights cut through the darkness of the long driveway. Blue and red lights began to pulse against the wet glass of the study windows. Evelyn froze. She glanced toward the window, her face pale. "No, it's too early. The transport isn't until morning." "It's not the transport," Leo said, his voice shaking but filled with a sudden, desperate hope. "It's Detective Vance. I called him. He knew Mom. He knows about the breaks." Evelyn's grip on the letter opener tightened until her knuckles turned white. For a second, she looked like she might bolt. But then, she looked at Thomas, semi-conscious and vulnerable, and then at Leo. A terrifying realization crossed her face. If she couldn't have the money, she would at least finish what she started. "Then I'll just have to move faster," she whispered. She didn't run for the door. She ran for the desk, reaching for the heavy silver pitcher of water. She didn't want the letter opener anymore. She wanted to finish the job the tea had started. She lunged for Thomas, intending to force the rest of the drugged liquid down his throat to make it look like an overdose before the police could break down the door. "No!" Leo screamed. He didn't think. He didn't plan. He threw his entire body weight into Evelyn's knees. She went down hard, her chin hitting the edge of the mahogany desk with a sickening thud. The pitcher shattered on the floor, drenching the blueprints in a mix of water and shattered glass. At that exact moment, the front door of the mansion downstairs was kicked open with a thunderous crash. "Police! Stay where you are!" Evelyn scrambled to her feet, blood trickling from her lip, her eyes darting around the room like a trapped animal. She looked at the balcony doors, the ones leading out to the cliffside. She didn't look back at Thomas. She didn't look at Leo. She bolted for the glass doors, throwing them open to the howling wind and the salt spray of the Atlantic. "Leo!" Thomas whispered, his eyes finally fluttering open with a spark of true clarity. "Leo, I'm so sorry." Leo ignored the cold wind whipping into the room. He ran to his father, grabbing his hand. "Stay awake, Dad! They're here! Just stay awake!" In the doorway, A tall man in a soaked trench coat appeared, a service pistol drawn and steady. Detective Vance's eyes swept the room, taking in the shattered glass, the slumped man, and the small boy holding on for dear life. "Where is she?" Vance barked. Leo pointed to the open balcony. "The cliffs! She went to the cliffs!" The wind shrieked through the open balcony doors, tearing at the heavy velvet curtains and sending loose blueprints swirling like panicked birds. Detective Vance didn't hesitate. He vaulted over the low windowsill, his boots skidding on the wet stone of the terrace. "Leo, stay with your father!" Vance shouted over his shoulder before disappearing into the wall of rain. Leo ignored the command. He couldn't stay still. His heart was a drum, and the adrenaline was the only thing keeping his legs from collapsing. He grabbed a heavy wool throw from the sofa and wrapped it around his father's shivering shoulders. Thomas's eyes were open now, but they were glazed, tracking Leo's movements with a heartbreaking slowness. The tea," Thomas murmured, his tongue thick. "Don't talk, Dad. Just breathe," Leo whispered. He looked toward the balcony. The blue and red police lights from the driveway reflected off the mist, creating a haunting, ethereal glow. On the cliffside, the world was a jagged mess of black rock and white foam. Evelyn was running, her silk dress clinging to her skin, her heels long ago discarded. She knew these grounds. She had redesigned the gardens herself. But in the dark and the deluge, the familiar had become a death trap. "Evelyn, stop!" Vance's voice boomed, amplified by the natural bowl of the cliffs. She reached the perimeter fence, the waist-high stone wall that separated the manicured lawn from the 300-foot drop into the Atlantic. She turned, her back to the abyss, her hair plastered across her face like a veil of seaweed. "Stay back!" she screamed. "I'll jump. I'll tell them you pushed me. I'll make sure you lose your badge, Vance." Vance slowed his pace. His hands held out in a calming gesture, though his pistol remained gripped firmly in his right hand. "It's over, Evelyn. We have the phone records. We have the bank transfers Leo found. And we have the mechanic's report from Sarah's car." Evelyn let out a high, thin laugh that was lost to the wind. "That report was a fake! I burned the original!" "Actually," Vance said, stepping closer, "you burned a photocopy. Sarah was smarter than you gave her credit for. She left the original in a safety deposit box that Leo's trust fund was linked to. I just got the warrant cleared an hour ago." The lie, the beautiful, expensive lie she had built, was crumbling into the sea. Evelyn's face contorted. For a moment, she looked like she might actually leap. Her eyes darted down to the churning surf below, where the waves smashed against the rocks with enough force to grind bone to powder. But Evelyn was a coward at her core. She loved her life too much to end it. She loved the power, the clothes, and the prestige. I was going to be someone," she hissed, her voice dropping to a venomous whisper. "I wasn't going to be just another assistant. I deserved this house. I deserved his money." "You deserve a cell," Vance countered. Suddenly, a small figure appeared at the edge of the terrace. Leo stood there, drenched, his small face illuminated by a lightning strike that turned the sky a brilliant, bruised white. "Why?" Leo screamed, his voice carrying over the roar of the ocean. "Why my mom? She never did anything to you." Evelyn looked at the boy, and for the first time, the mask didn't just slip. It shattered. "Because she had everything I wanted," she shrieked back. "And she was too weak to keep it." As she lunged forward, not to jump, but to try and push past Vance in a final, desperate break for the woods, her foot slipped on a patch of moss-covered stone. A scream ripped from her throat as she tipped backward over the low wall. Vance moved with lightning speed, dropping his gun and lunging over the ledge. He caught her wrist just as her body cleared the stone. For a second, Evelyn dangled over the void, her legs kicking uselessly against the air, the Atlantic hungrily waiting below. She looked up, her eyes wide with a pure primal terror. "Please," she begged, her voice cracking. "Please, don't let me go!" Vance's face was set in a grim mask of exertion. He looked down at her, then back at Leo, who was watching from the terrace. Justice was inches away. All he had to do was let the rain-slick skin of her wrist slide through his fingers. But Vance was a cop, and Leo was watching. With a guttural grunt, Vance hauled her back over the wall, pinning her face down onto the wet grass. The metallic click of handcuffs closing was the sweetest sound Leo had ever heard. "Evelyn Thorne," Vance panted. "You're under arrest for the murder of Sarah Blackwood and the attempted murder of Thomas Blackwood." Leo slumped against the doorframe of the study, the strength finally leaving his body. He felt a hand on his shoulder. He turned to see his father, standing unsteadily, leaning against the wall for support. Thomas wasn't looking at the police. He was looking at his son. And for the first time in years, the fog in his eyes was gone. There was only pain and the beginning of a long, overdue clarity. "Leo!" Thomas choked out, pulling the boy into a fierce, trembling embrace. "I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry." The storm was still raging, but for the first time, the house felt like it was starting to dry out. The following morning did not bring the usual peace of a sunrise. The Blackwood estate was swarming with forensic teams in white Tyvek suits, their methodical movements a sharp contrast to the chaotic violence of the night before. Yellow crime scene tape fluttered in the sea breeze, cordoning off the balcony and the master suite. Thomas sat in the sun-drenched breakfast nook, a heavy blanket over his shoulders. A paramedic had cleared him of any life-threatening toxicity, but the herbal tea Evelyn had been serving contained a cocktail of slow-acting sedatives and low-grade arsenic. It hadn't been meant to kill him instantly, just to make him appear depressed, confused, and eventually incapable of managing his own affairs. "I let her into our home, Leo," Thomas whispered, his voice rasping. He stared into a mug of plain coffee, his hands still trembling slightly. "I let her treat you like a stranger in your own house, because I was too blinded by my own grief to see the truth." Leo sat across from him, looking smaller than ever in his oversized hoodie. "She was good at it, Dad. She made me feel like I was the problem. I started to believe her." Thomas reached across the table, his fingers brushing Leo's hand. "Never again. I promise you, Leo. Never again." The heavy front door opened, and Detective Vance walked in, carrying a thick accordion folder. He looked like he hadn't slept in 48 hours, his stubble dark against his pale skin. He pulled out a chair and sat down with a heavy sigh. "We spent the night going through her home office and the burner phone we recovered from the bushes," Vance said, laying out several documents on the table. "It's worse than we thought, Thomas. She wasn't just skimming off the top of the firm. She had already initiated a private sale of the Blackwood estate to an offshore holding company. The closing date was set for next Friday." Thomas blinked, the shock hitting him like a physical blow. "She was selling the house while we were still living in it?" "She had forged your power of attorney while you were under the influence of those treatments," Vance explained, pointing to a signature that looked uncannily like Thomas's. "She was planning to have Leo committed to that residential facility on Monday, and by the time you realized the house was gone, she'd have been in a country with no extradition treaty." Leo watched his father's face. He saw the anger bubbling up, but beneath it, there was a profound sense of violation. This wasn't just about money. It was about the desecration of his mother's memory. "And my mom?" Leo asked, his voice steady. "Did you find proof about the car?" Vance's expression softened. He pulled out a small, encrypted USB drive. We found a series of emails between Evelyn and a consultant, basically a high-end fixer. They discussed the structural integrity of the cliffside road and the shelf life of brake fluid when exposed to specific corrosives. She didn't just tamper with the car, Leo. She choreographed it. The room went silent. The weight of the truth was a physical presence, heavy and cold. She's talking, though, Vance added, a grim smile touching his lips. Once she realized the evidence we had, she started trying to cut a deal. She's blaming the fixer, claiming she was coerced. But we have the bank transfers. Every cent she paid him came from your mother's life insurance payout, Thomas. Thomas stood up abruptly, the chair screeching against the tile. He walked to the window, looking out at the spot where the car had gone over the edge 3 years ago.
She used Sarah's death to fund her own murder,
Thomas said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl. She's never coming back here, Vance assured them. The DA is looking at first-degree murder, attempted murder, and grand larceny. She'll spend the rest of her life behind bars. As Vance left to coordinate with the forensics team in the attic, Leo felt a strange sensation. For the first time in years, the house didn't feel haunted by Sarah's ghost. It felt like her spirit was finally resting, the truth having acted as a final, peaceful benediction. But as Leo went to help his father clear the table, he noticed a small black notebook that had fallen out of Vance's folder. It wasn't a police report. It was Evelyn's personal ledger. Curious, Leo opened it to the last page. His heart skipped a beat. Under a list of dates and dollar amounts, there was a single name written in red ink, circled 3 times. Dr. Aris. Leo looked up at his father. Dr. Aris was the family therapist who had been treating Leo for his behavioral issues, the same doctor who had recommended the residential facility. The betrayal ran deeper than just one woman. Evelyn hadn't acted alone. Leo felt a cold shiver crawl down his spine as he stared at the name in the ledger. Dr. Aris, the man he had sat across from every Tuesday for 6 months. The man who had nodded sympathetically while Leo cried about missing his mother, only to turn around and tell Thomas that the boy was delusional and prone to fabrication. "Dad," Leo whispered, his voice trembling as he held out the notebook. "Look." Thomas took the ledger, his eyes narrowing as he read the red ink. Below the doctor's name was a series of dates, each one corresponding to the day after Leo's therapy sessions, and a dollar amount, $5,000. "Consultation fees?" Thomas muttered, his face turning a dangerous shade of crimson. "I paid his invoices through the firm. Why would Evelyn be paying him separately from her private account?" "Because he wasn't treating me, Dad," Leo said, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. "He was helping her convince you I was crazy. Every time I told him she was mean to me, he told you I was projecting my anger over Mom." Thomas slammed the ledger onto the table, the sound echoing like a gunshot. "That son of a—" He grabbed his phone, his fingers flying across the screen. "Vance, get back in here!" The detective, who had been halfway down the driveway, jogged back into the kitchen, his hand instinctively on his holster. "What is it?" Thomas pointed to the ledger. "Dr. Aris, my son's therapist. It looks like my wife was putting him on a private retainer. Is there any record of this in her digital files?" Vance took the notebook, his eyes scanning the entries. He pulled out his radio. "Dispatch, this is Vance. I need a warrant for the financial records and office of a Dr. Julian Aris, West Mountain Psychological. Check for any link to a shell company called ET Designs or Symmetry Holdings. Yeah, now." He looked at Thomas, his expression grim. "In cases like this, they usually don't act alone. They need experts to validate the gaslighting. If Aris was in on it, he's facing accessory to attempted murder and medical malpractice. It's a career ender, at the very least. I want him in handcuffs, Thomas growled. He played with my son's mind while he was grieving. We'll get him, Vance promised. But Leo, I need you to think. Did Dr. Aris ever give you anything? Any medicine? Any vitamin drinks? Leo thought back to the small blue cups of water Aris always insisted he drink before they started their play therapy. He remembered how sleepy he would get, how his words would feel heavy in his mouth. The blue cups, Leo said, his eyes wide. He told me it was special water to help me focus, but after I drank it, I couldn't remember everything we talked about. I just felt fuzzy. Vance nodded slowly. Sedatives, to make you appear sluggish and unstable when your father picked you up. It's a classic move. Thomas turned away, leaning his forehead against the cool glass of the window. He felt a wave of nausea. He had handed his son over to a predator, paying for the privilege of having his child's spirit broken. But there was no time for wallowing. Within the hour, 3 more police cruisers arrived. One stayed at the house, while the others roared off toward the city, sirens wailing. Leo watched them go from the porch. The sun was higher now, burning off the morning mist, but the air still felt thin. He looked at the vast, empty rooms of the mansion behind him. It was a beautiful house, but it was filled with too many lies. We can't stay here, can we? Leo asked as his father walked out to join him. Thomas looked at the sprawling lawn, the designer furniture, and the cold, modern lines of the estate he had spent a decade building. No, Leo, we can't. This house was built on a dream that turned into a nightmare. We're going to find somewhere new, somewhere small, somewhere that belongs to just the 2 of us. And Mom? Thomas reached into his pocket and pulled out the small framed photo Leo had been holding the night Evelyn threatened him. He had rescued it from the nightstand. Mom stays with us, Thomas said softly. Always. Just then, Vance's radio crackled to life. Vance, this is Unit 4. We have Aris in custody. He tried to flush a ledger of his own down the toilet when we breached. We recovered enough. He's singing like a bird to avoid the attempted murder charge. He's pinning everything on Thorne. Let him sing, Vance replied. The more they turn on each other, the easier the trial will be. He looked at Leo and Thomas. It's over, for real this time. Leo felt a weight lift off his chest, but as he looked at the horizon, a final thought occurred to him. He remembered the last entry in his mother's journal, the one about the blue trunk. There was one detail he hadn't told anyone. One final secret his mother had left behind. The morning light was harsh, exposing every dust mote and fingerprint in the grand hallway. While the police focused on the electronics and the ledgers, Leo felt a magnetic pull back toward the attic. There was a detail in his mother's journal that had been gnawing at his mind since the chaos began. If anything happens to me, look in the lining of the blue trunk. But remember, Leo, the house has its own memory. He stood before the blue trunk again. It looked ordinary now, its mystery stripped away by the previous night's violence. He had already found the mechanic's report, but his mother's words suggested something more. The house has its own memory. Leo knelt on the dusty floorboards. He ran his fingers along the base of the trunk, then moved them to the wall behind it. He noticed a slight misalignment in the wainscoting, a gap no wider than a credit card. He pushed. A small panel clicked and popped open. Inside was a single, old-fashioned VHS tape and a small, silver key with a tag that read, Vault 412. Leo, what are you doing up here? Thomas stood in the doorway, his face pale but his eyes clear. He walked over and knelt beside his son, looking at the items in Leo's hand. I found these behind the wall, Leo whispered. Mom hidden them. They went down to the media room, a place Evelyn had redesigned to be sleek and cold. removing all the clutter of their old life. Tucked away in a cabinet was an old VCR Thomas had refused to throw out. With shaking hands, he pushed the tape in. The screen flickered with static, then settled into a grainy, warm image. It was Sarah. She looked tired, her eyes rimmed with red, sitting in the very study where the attack had happened. The date on the bottom of the screen was 3 days before her death. "Thomas, if you're seeing this, it means I was right to be afraid." Sarah's voice was steady, though her hands trembled. "Evelyn isn't just an associate. I found out she's been using your firm to launder money for a development project that doesn't exist, but it's more than that. She's been gaslighting you, giving you those sleep aids that make you forget our conversations." Thomas let out a choked sob, his hand gripping the arm of the sofa. "I've put the original documents, the real contracts, and the proof of her identity theft in a safe deposit box. The key is in the attic. But I wanted you to hear this from me. I love you, Thomas, and I love Leo. Don't let her take our home. Don't let her take our son's future." The screen went to black. The silence that followed was heavy. Thomas sat frozen, the reality of how long he had been manipulated finally sinking in. He hadn't just been a victim of a sudden plot. He had been systematically dismantled by the woman he thought was his partner. "She killed her," Thomas whispered, his voice cracking. "She knew Sarah was on to her, and she killed her to keep the secret."
But she didn't win, Dad,
Leo said, stepping closer and putting his hand on his father's shoulder.
Mom won. She kept the proof. She saved us, even from back then.
Thomas looked at the silver key, Vault 412. This was the final nail in Evelyn's coffin. It wasn't just bank records, it was the identity theft Sarah mentioned. He called Detective Vance back into the room. When the detective saw the tape and the key, his jaw dropped.
"This is the missing link," Vance said. "We knew she was Evelyn Thorne, but we couldn't figure out why her records only went back 5 years. This key, it probably leads to her real identity."
An hour later, at the downtown branch of the city's oldest bank, Vance and Thomas opened Vault 412. Inside was a folder containing a birth certificate for a woman named Lydia Vance, no relation to the detective, and a series of court documents from a state 300 miles away. Evelyn Thorne didn't exist. She was a convicted fraudster who had vanished while on parole for a similar scheme involving an elderly widower. She had changed her name, her face, and her history to find a new target, and she had found Thomas Blackwood.
"She's a professional,"
Vance muttered, flipping through the mugshots of a younger, darker-haired Lydia. "She didn't love you, Thomas. She didn't even see you. You were just a bank account with a heartbeat." Thomas didn't look hurt. He looked relieved. The woman he had felt guilty about betraying wasn't real. The guilt that had been eating him alive, the feeling that he was destroying his new family, evaporated. He turned to Leo, who was standing by the bank's marble pillars.
"Let's go, Leo," Thomas said.
"Where?"
"To the lawyers. We're going to make sure every cent she stole is recovered. And then," Thomas paused, a small, genuine smile touching his lips for the first time in years. "We're going to go find that beach house your mom always talked about. The one with the porch that faces the sunset."
As they walked out of the bank, the sun was bright and the city hummed with life. But for Leo, the most important revelation was yet to come, because as they drove away, he realized the shocking twist his mother had hinted at in her journal wasn't about the money or the murder. It was about the letter he found tucked inside the safe deposit box, addressed only to him. The car ride back to the estate was silent, but it wasn't the heavy, suffocating silence of the past few years. It was the silence of a fever finally breaking. Leo sat in the back seat, his fingers tracing the edges of the cream-colored envelope he had pulled from the safe deposit box. It was addressed in his mother's elegant looping cursive. To my Leo, for the day the sun returns. Thomas caught his son's eye in the rear-view mirror.
You okay, bud?
I think so, Dad, Leo whispered. I want to read this alone.
Take all the time you need.
When they arrived at the mansion, the forensic teams were packing up. The house felt hollowed out, like a giant rib cage with the heart missing. Leo retreated to his favorite spot, a small stone bench in the rose garden that his mother had planted. The roses were overgrown now, choked by weeds that Evelyn had refused to let the gardener pull, but a few stubborn red petals still clung to the thorny stems. He tore open the envelope. My dearest Leo, the letter began. If you are reading this, it means you've found the strength I always knew you had. It means you've looked past the shadows and found the truth. I need to tell you something your father never could, because I asked him to keep it a secret until you were ready.
Leo's breath hitched. He scanned the lines, his eyes blurring with tears.
Evelyn didn't just appear in our lives by accident. She was a shadow from my own past, someone I met years ago when I was a young journalist investigating corporate fraud. I thought I had helped put her away, but she was smarter than I was. She found us. She targeted Thomas not just for his money, but to get to me, to take everything I loved as revenge.
Leo felt a cold chill. The accident hadn't just been a crime of opportunity. It was a vendetta. But here is the secret, Leo. The trust fund isn't just money. Inside the blue trunk, beneath the lining where you found the report, there is a second false bottom. Use the silver key. Inside, you will find the deed to the lighthouse cottage in Maine, the one my grandfather left me. Evelyn never knew about it because I kept it in my maiden name. It is your sanctuary. It is a place where she can never find you.
I knew she was coming for me, Leo. I knew the brakes were failing. I tried to tell your father, but she had already started the treatments on him. My biggest regret is leaving you to face her alone. But remember, you are a storyteller. You have the power to write your own ending. Leo stood up, the letter clutched to his chest. He looked up at the master's suite balcony where Evelyn had almost ended it all. He realized then that Evelyn's greatest mistake wasn't the money or the murder. It was underestimating a mother's foresight. He ran back into the house, finding his father in the study, staring at the empty space where his desk once stood.
Dad, we have to go to the attic! One more time!
Thomas followed his son, his exhaustion momentarily forgotten. They reached the blue trunk. Leo knelt, feeling for a second latch, a second secret. He found a small indentation near the hinge. He inserted the silver key and turned.
Click.
The entire bottom of the trunk shifted. Beneath a layer of old silk scarves was a stack of documents and a weathered, hand-drawn map of a coastline.
The lighthouse, Thomas breathed, looking at the deed. Sarah, she bought it back? She told me it was sold years ago. She kept it for us, Leo said. She knew we'd need a place to go.
Just then, the front door downstairs was kicked open.
Thomas! Leo, get down here! It was Detective Vance. His voice was urgent, but there was a note of grim satisfaction in it.
They hurried down the stairs to find Vance standing in the foyer, holding a tablet. On the screen was a live news feed. The headline read, Prominent Therapist Turns State's Evidence in Blackwood Murder Case.
Aris broke, Vance said, his eyes bright. But that's not the news. The news is that when they processed Evelyn, Lydia at the station, they found a hidden compartment in her handbag. She wasn't just planning to flee with the money. She had a list, Thomas. Vance swiped the screen to a photo of a handwritten note. It was a list of names,
All wealthy widowers in the tri-state area. But at the bottom, there was a date. October 14th. That's 3 days from now, Thomas noted.
She was planning to stage your accidental overdose on the 14th, Vance said. She had the whole thing scripted. She was going to be the tragic widow for the second time in 4 years.
Thomas felt a shiver of pure horror. If Leo hadn't listened at the door, if Leo hadn't found that recorder, Thomas wouldn't have made it to the end of the week.
She's not a person,
Thomas whispered. She's a ghost story.
Well, Vance said, closing the tablet. The story's over. She's been denied bail. And because of the evidence you found in the safe deposit box, the feds are picking up the case. She's going to a maximum security facility. She'll never see the sun from a cliffside again. Leo looked at the map of the lighthouse in his hand. The evil stepmother had been defeated, but the father had finally woken up. Dad, Leo said, looking at the grand, cold house around them. Let's leave, right now. We don't need any of this.
Thomas looked at the marble, the crystal, and the steel. Then he looked at his son, the boy who had saved his life.
You're right, Leo. Pack your mother's journals. Leave the rest.
As they walked out the front door, Thomas didn't even look back to lock it. He knew the police would handle the estate. He knew the lawyers would handle the money. All he cared about was the small hand gripping his as they walked toward the car. But as they reached the driveway, a black sedan pulled up. A woman Leo didn't recognize stepped out. She was dressed in a sharp suit, holding a legal briefcase.
Mr. Blackwood? She asked. I'm the court-appointed receiver for the Thorne assets. I have one more thing for your son.
She reached into her bag and pulled out a small velvet box.
We found this in the safe in Evelyn's dressing room. It was labeled trash, but I thought you might want it.
Leo opened the box. Inside was his mother's wedding ring, the one Evelyn had claimed was lost during the funeral. The final piece of their life had come home. Chapter 14. The Lighthouse of New Beginnings. The salt air was different here. It wasn't the heavy, oppressive mist of the Blackwood estate. It was crisp, sharp, and carried the scent of pine and wild roses. 6 months had passed since the night the door was kicked open. 6 months since the world had learned the name Lydia Vance and the depth of her depravity. Leo stood on the gallery of the lighthouse, the wind whipping through his hair. Below him, the Atlantic churned, but here, the waves felt like old friends rather than hungry predators. Behind him, the small stone cottage, the sanctuary his mother had promised, glowed with the warm light of a wood-burning stove.
Leo, Coco's ready,
Thomas called from the kitchen. His voice was different now. The hollow, haunted rasp was gone, replaced by a resonance that sounded like life. He had spent the last half-year in intensive recovery, purging the toxins from his body and the guilt from his soul. He no longer spent his nights staring at blueprints of skyscrapers. Now, he spent them teaching Leo how to restore the old brass lantern of the lighthouse. Leo climbed down the spiral stairs, his feet light on the iron steps. He walked into the kitchen, where a stack of books sat on the table. They weren't ledgers or legal documents. They were stories. I heard from Vance today, Thomas said, handing Leo a steaming mug. The sentencing came down, life without parole for Lydia. And Dr. Eris? He's looking at 20 years. He tried to claim he was under her spell, but the jury didn't buy it for a second. Leo took a sip of the cocoa, the warmth spreading through his chest.
Does it feel real yet, Dad? That she's actually gone?
Thomas sat down across from him, his eyes fixed on his son. It felt real the moment we drove away from that house, Leo. But it feels right now, because of you. Thomas reached into a drawer and pulled out a thick manuscript. It was the story Leo had been writing. The one that started in the nursery and ended on the cliffs. I read the ending you wrote this morning. About the boy who saved the king. Leo blushed.
It's just a story, Dad.
No, Thomas said firmly. It's the truth. I was lost in the dark, Leo. I was a man who had built walls of glass and steel to hide from my own heart. You were the one who broke the door down. You were the one who listened when I was deaf. He reached across the table and squeezed Leo's hand, not with the desperate grip of a drowning man, but with the steady strength of a father. Justice isn't just about putting people in cages, Leo. Thomas continued, his voice softening. It's about taking back what they tried to steal. They tried to steal our memories of your mother. They tried to steal our trust in each other. But look around. Leo looked out the window. On the mantel sat the framed photo of Sarah, her wedding ring resting in a small glass dish beside it. The evil stepmother had wanted the Blackwood fortune, the estate, and the prestige. In the end, she had nothing but a number in a prison registry. But Leo and Thomas had everything. They had the lighthouse, they had the journals, and most importantly, they had the truth. As the sun began to sink below the horizon, painting the main sky in brilliant streaks of gold and violet, Thomas stood up and walked to the lighthouse switch. With a practiced click, the great lantern above them hummed to life, sending a powerful beam of light cutting through the gathering dusk. It was a warning to those at sea. But for Leo, it was something else. It was a signal that the storm was finally over. The secrets were out, the betrayals were answered, and the boy who everyone thought was broken had become the architect of their new life.
Ready for chapter 1? Thomas asked, gesturing to the blank notebook on the table.
Leo picked up a pen, a small, knowing smile on his face. He thought of his mother's words. You have the power to write your own ending.
Actually, Dad, Leo said, looking out at the endless, beautiful sea, I think this is the part where the real story begins.